Thank you. So thank you for having me. I'm going to start the presentation then. So just a bit about me. I'm a data strategist and I've worked across brand, marketing and communications for around 10 years. I have a real interest in using data to tell human stories and organizational stories, and most recently I've worked for Amnesty International. So in terms of the contents that we will be going through in this presentation, I will take you through some principles of dissemination and measurement, namely channels, measurement. We'll go through a case study, and then we'll have time for some discussion before coming back to specifics about platforms and tools, and a final Q&A, so questions and answers. So I will be using quite a few specialist definitions or specialist terms in this presentation. So it will be good for us to just review what those mean now. The first is KPIs. So these are key performance indicators, and they are a measurable value that demonstrates how effectively a goal is being met. So an example of a KPI can be the number of customers that you've ended up with after a campaign to sell something. And that's a very commercial KPI. The next is media monitoring and press clippings. And these are methods that are used to log press coverage of a brand or a specific output or set of outputs. So when you produce a press release and your campaign goes live, you want to then be able to measure to what extent the media picked that up, and therefore how many people may have seen it. The next concept is circulation, and this is the number of copies that a newspaper has distributed. So circulation figures are quite literally, so for instance, the New York Times or Le Monde, they might distribute, I don't know, maybe a couple million copies of the newspaper every day. And that's what a circulation figure is. And we'll come across that much later in the presentation when we talk about measurement. The next is footfall. So it's actually quite similar to circulation because it's about physical space, but it's the number of people passing through a physical space in a given time. And you would normally use this when you have physical advertisements, such as billboards and posters at things like bus stops. You then have the bounce rate. Now this is quite specific to website contexts and email context, but it's the rate at which an audience fails to interact with a specific output. So on a website, it may be that someone has come to your website and they've landed on a page and they have failed to stay on that page for 30 seconds, for example, but they've left immediately. That's a bounce. Then there's social listening, and you may come across this term quite a lot. This is a method that's used to measure external social media conversation around a given topic or by a particular audience, and is usually the main source is Twitter because of its very public facing nature. The next term is campaign reach, and that is quite literally the number of people exposed to a campaign output. So how far did it go? And it's quite similar to circulation, actually, just how many people were exposed to your campaign output. The next concept is campaign conversion. So of those people who were exposed to your output, how many times, how many of them completed a goal? So that goal can be, you have an advert in a local newspaper that's encouraging people to sign a petition, or the conversion would be how many of those people who saw that advert then went on to sign that petition. How many of them were converted? The next concept is owned media. So we're going to go through three terms actually: owned media, earned media, and paid media. And owned media, these are media channels that feature content that you have complete control over. So examples of those might be your radio station, your television channel. It might be your Facebook pages and your Twitter accounts. But this has content that you have control over. It's your content. You own it. The next concept is earned media. So these are media channels that are not yours, and they might choose to feature your content voluntarily, but you don't have complete control over what they decide to say about your content. So an example of that actually is news coverage. So you might write a press release that gets picked up by a national newspaper, but you don't really have control over what they say about your output. And the final concept is paid media. Now, paid media is essentially it's media channels that you have to pay to feature your content. So an example actually might be Facebook adverts that you need to pay for in order to have your content featured. So those are our key definitions. So I'm going to go into campaign dissemination. And this stage comes after your messaging and your target audience have been defined. So once you've got past the campaign ideation stage and the refinement stage, and you've decided on your messaging and your target audience, that's when you would start thinking about dissemination. And the aim of dissemination, I've highlighted some words here, but the aim of dissemination is to deliver your message to your target audience using appropriate channels in order to evoke the thoughts and feelings that lead to your desired campaign actions. So you would be delivering your message that may be about, for instance, ending workplace discrimination to hiring managers, and those hiring managers are your target audience, for example. And you may choose to use posters to do that, or videos on LinkedIn in order to do that, because the aim is to evoke the kinds of thoughts and feelings that make them think, oh, maybe this is wrong, and maybe I should stop discriminating in hiring, that lead to your desired campaign actions, which is a reduction in discrimination in hiring. And the point of campaign dissemination is that you need to meet the audience where they are and tailor materials to the channel. And there is no campaigning without campaign dissemination. Now, campaign measurement is done in conjunction with campaign dissemination. And what that is campaign measurement determines the effectiveness of a campaign. And it's generally broken down into that campaign reach that we discussed in the definition. So that reach is to what extent did your campaign reach your audience? How many people saw it? How many people came across your campaign? You then have campaign conversion, which is a second stage, which is to what extent did your audience then complete the desired action? And those two in conjunction are probably the essence of campaign measurement. So how many people saw your thing? To what extent was your campaign exposed to people? And then how many people did the thing that you wanted them to do? And that stage can be done actually throughout the campaign cycle, because you can do it before a campaign starts or before the dissemination of the campaign starts, because you may use it for what's termed horizon scanning, which is just determining what the landscape looks like currently. Are people talking about this thing? Why do we need a campaign here? And that could be done actually during the ideation stage. During the campaign, when you've put materials out, if you notice that those materials are not reaching the right people, or they're not reaching enough people, or they're not converting enough people, you could use campaign measurement during the campaign to optimize your campaign and test various messages. And this is normally easiest in a digital context. So normally when you have adverts online, it's a bit easier to do this kind of optimization and testing during the campaign. The next stage is after the campaign. So this is where it's campaign measurement is normally done, and it's normally part of a wider evaluation. And what you should get from that is definitely a learning opportunity, but also you want to find out ultimately the action of your campaign. To what extent did the audience complete the desired action? So what I hope you've taken from this is that campaign measurement is dependent on the dissemination. And we'll go into a bit more detail a bit later. So the channels. So channels, I think there's a lot of confusion between channels and media, but the channel is the destination of your campaign materials. So, for example, video is not a channel. Video is a medium. YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram are channels, however. So video may go up on your YouTube, TikTok, or Instagram, or Facebook, of course. And channels can be online, they can be offline, or actually for a lot of campaigns, it's a combination of both. And I think that's likely to be what a lot of you may do. And I wanted to mention that an integrated approach may enable you to reach a broader range of people multiple times. And any measurement and KPIs, so those key performance indicators that I mentioned earlier, must take that into account. So if your audience is split across multiple channels, and some of them are online and offline, you have to take the fact that you've used various channels into account. Additionally, some channels are definitely harder to measure than others. That example of footfall data that I mentioned before, when it comes to billboards and advertising in physical space, that's a bit harder to measure than others, but those figures are there because they're normally used as a guide, and they're normally used to determine the cost of advertising. So some key aspects to consider when choosing your channels is the audience presence and uptake. So are your audience present on that channel? And if so, what do they use it for? The cost, definitely some channels are more expensive than others because ultimately you're paying for attention. The level of ownership, so those three definitions we looked at earlier, owned media, so those are the channels that you have complete control of. The earned media, so other people, other entities or other organizations' channels that pick up, that give you attention and decide to showcase your work, and you generally don't have to pay them, or that paid media that you will have to pay for. And they all have differing levels of effectiveness depending on your own goal. And generally, and this is just generally speaking, if you have a campaign and you want it to get to, I don't know, say 2,000 people, you want to get this campaign in front of 2,000 people, unless you have quite a large social media presence that is owned, so unless your own Facebook channels are quite large and you have lots of followers and fans and interaction, in order to reach that goal, you may need to opt for some of these other channels. So that earned media might be potentially some posters in a physical space, or it might be getting in touch with a journalist of a local or a regional newspaper so that they feature your content for free. And that's that press interaction that I mentioned a bit earlier. That paid media, of course, is also an option. And if you want, you can pay to have your campaign showcased outside of your channels. And of course, you'll have control over that because you paid for it. But those are things to consider, definitely, the level of ownership. Because in an earned channel, you may not have complete control over the messaging. So here's just an example. So you may have complete control over your Facebook page or television station, as I've mentioned, but it might not reach as many people. As I mentioned, in the regional newspaper, owned by a press release, so you may need to write a press release in order to get that media, that earned media reach, or some advertising on Instagram, which you will need to pay for. And the final thing is feedback and learning. Some channels provide more opportunity for insight generation than others. That's actually often the digital channels, because digital is so measurable. You often have more data coming out of digital channels than you do offline channels. So into measurement. A key part of campaign evaluation, it's a very important part of campaign evaluation and campaigning as a whole. And what it does is it allows campaigners to quantify success. So that reach figure that we talked about, how far did it go? How many people saw it? Conversion, did those people who saw it take the desired action? So an example may be, I work for Nike and I'm trying to sell shoes. This is a very different type of campaign, but just it's a bit easier to demonstrate as an example. If I'm trying to sell shoes for Nike, I may say I want this campaign to reach about 1 million people. I'm going to use various tactics. I'm going to use various channels. I'm going to feature in Vogue. I'm going to pay for advertising on Facebook. I'm going to create enough buzz through press release and create enough attention through press releases that I will write very carefully so that national and international newspapers decide to feature my campaign for free. However, from that, did people buy those shoes? Did I create enough buzz in the right way for people to buy those shoes. And that is that conversion figure that I'm referring to. So did they take the desired action? In your cases, it may be behavioral or attitudinal change. And what I mean by that is, yes, there's behavior, and that might be buying shoes, that might be ending discrimination, but did it change their attitudes? Did they suddenly see that that discrimination was wrong, for instance? So I suppose the point of this is that it depends on the dissemination channels that you use and your messaging. Your KPIs have to take that into account. For example, if a social media campaign was disseminated across all major social networks, but TikTok is the key campaigning channel, then your KPIs should focus on TikTok. You can give a hierarchy to your KPIs. You can say that your key performance indicator is TikTok views, but then we have extra metrics, so those measurables that we can use as secondary measurements in order to assess the campaign as a whole. So as I mentioned, digital channels produce a lot of metrics for measurement purposes. More examples. So this is the aim of this is to link dissemination to measurement. So a video posted to a local authority Facebook account, the measurement might be organic reach and of course video views. A press release in a national newspaper, the measurement might be media mentions and newspaper circulation, those circulation figures that I talked about, the number of issues that newspaper has circulated. A Twitter campaign post by staff brand ambassadors, and what I mean by that is actually the youngsters that you work with, for instance, they may decide to feature the campaign that you've all worked on collectively on their own personal Twitter accounts. So you may choose, if you wanted to measure the mentions of their Twitter accounts. You may decide to do some social listening, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail later. But you may decide to do some social listening that looks at the number of times that your campaign was mentioned on their accounts, or how many retweets they got from their Twitter accounts. A blog on a website, because it's a website, we're talking about digital and website analytics, so you'd be looking at page views, maybe some engagement metrics like the time on page, how long did they actually read your content for. Now, here's some offline dissemination. So if you're hosting an outreach workshop and it's attended by a local journalist, because you've decided that actually a big part of your dissemination will be to engage with the media in the community, then what you may choose to measure is the event attendees, because it's a workshop and you want to make sure that your message got to the people who attended the workshop. You may decide to measure the media mentions, so the number of times your campaign was mentioned in the media. And again, you may decide to look at Twitter keyword mentions, so how many times somebody tweeted about your event. You might have a poster campaign, and that poster might sit in local authority offices. So for instance, an example might be the discrimination in hiring campaign that you have. And in this case, you may choose to look at recall rates via staff and visitor polling. So I'm going to mention what this is. So recall rates generally in advertising are the number of people who can recall a campaign. So how many people remember a campaign that you've done? Can they say that they remember this campaign? To what extent did that campaign have an effect on them enough for them to remember it? And you can do that actually by taking surveys of the people in those local authority offices. Did you see this poster? You can ask them. Of course, there's surveys, focus groups, and on posters, very often QR code tracking. So if you have a QR code that takes you to a website, you can track the number of times that QR code has been followed. And then we have two other examples, so influencer, TikTok videos, followers, video views, again, very simple, digital analytics. And then maybe a billboard advertising. Let's say you decide to post a poster on a billboard telling people with your messaging. You could look at footfall data from local authorities if they have it. Not all local authorities will have footfall data, but the people who own the billboard might do as well. So just a case study. And I'll go through this fairly quickly. So Amnesty Argentina contacted Amnesty Global, who's my previous workplace, to help them get the issue of a historic vote on abortion into international media. So they wanted international attention on this vote that was taking place. So Amnesty bought a full-page advert in the back of the international New York Times, and it was done with the aim of putting pressure on senators in Argentina ahead of an historic vote on reproductive rights. The design was posted to Amnesty's own social accounts as well, and it was used in posters displayed by Amnesty Argentina at a very large rally in Buenos Aires on the day of the vote. Additionally, press releases were also issued, and a radio interview. I gave a radio interview because I did the concept. So we have lots of dissemination there. We have the advert in the back of the New York Times. We have the social media accounts by both Amnesty Global and Amnesty Argentina. We have all the press as well. So the radio interview, we have the press releases. There's quite a few ways that this was disseminated, and this is the design here. In terms of the measurement, how would we measure each of those things? We have the social media performance on Amnesty accounts, the estimated attendees at the rally, the circulation figures of the New York Times, how many issues of the New York Times exist, the media mentions of the campaign, the social media keyword and hashtag mentions, the petition sign-ups on the Amnesty website. I should have mentioned Amnesty had a petition, an online petition. The number of radio station listeners. When I gave that interview, there were radio station listeners. How many were there? Amnesty's website performance of any blogs related to this advert. And of course, the final outcome, which is the conversion figure. What was the result of the vote? Unfortunately, it was a no back then. A year or two later, it looks like it's a yes. So that sometimes that result is a long tail result. So you have to wait to see the conversion of attitude change campaigns like this, because this was about changing attitudes, and that takes time. So now we're going to go into a couple of pros and cons, and specifically I'm going to focus on social media because I know that a lot of your projects really make use of social media platforms. So we're going to go into the different platforms that there are, and then just some pros and cons of each platform, just to give a good profile of what each platform is used for, and then we can go into measurement. So the first platform, which is one I'm sure you've all used and you're all using now, and that's Facebook. So Facebook has about 2.2 billion monthly active users. I've left references in the presentation itself, so you'll be able to see where this information has come from. And the common age ranges, the most common age ranges for Facebook are between 18 and 29 and 30 to 49. So we have quite a broad age range of people. So essentially it's 18 to 49. The pros are that Facebook has such a large reach because it is, I suppose Facebook is ubiquitous, and Facebook as a company owns other platforms like WhatsApp and Instagram. So Facebook is huge. So it's got a very large reach. It's also got a very good, very comprehensive advertising platform. And just to give a bit of context, Facebook's advertising platform was so powerful in 2 sets of elections in the UK and US that we've ended up with an entirely new normal. And that's specific to the vote on the UK's exit from the EU and Donald Trump. So Facebook was very involved, and Facebook advertising played a huge part in that, in in those impacts on our day-to-day lives. So huge reach. The cons are that the advertising can be expensive, and Facebook advertising can also be very intrusive. I don't know if you've watched The Great Hack on Netflix, but the advertising can be intrusive. And because it's so large, it can have really large consequences. Instagram is another massive platform. So 1 billion monthly active users, also owned by Facebook, and the most common age range is 13 to 17 and 18 to 29. So in this latter part, you're reaching a lot of millennials, this 18 to 29 aspect, and Gen Z. The pros are something called IGTV, which is Instagram television, and that's a really, it makes it quite easy to advertise on there, because you can go from one channel to another, or you can allow, or users can allow Instagram television to just kind of roll as if they were watching TV. So that's a big pro. Another pro is hashtags. You can, as long as you have, you can find out which hashtags are doing well on Instagram and tailor your campaign accordingly, so that your campaign is likely to come up in the discovery section or the explore section on Instagram. Another pro is influencers. So there's real potential for influencer marketing. Instagram has cracked down on some of this recently, but influencers are as important as they were before. And with the recent changes to daily life because of the situation we're in now with COVID-19, there are a lot of influencers who are willing to work on different content, because people can't travel as much. The cons are it's very difficult to post links to Instagram because Instagram doesn't allow links in posts. Additionally, influencer adverts must be declared. You can't use an influencer, if you've paid an influencer, you can't pay them and not have them declare that they've been paid. They have to say that they've been paid. I've put this in as a con, because it can be exclusionary, and that's the very highly visual nature of Instagram. So for people who have issues with sight, it can be exclusionary. There are what are called alternative text fields in Instagram that allow you to do audio descriptions and things, but that might be something to take into consideration. So it's a highly visual platform. The next platform is TikTok. So this emerged about 3 years ago. It's massive now. It's definitely the platform that's grown the fastest. The one prior to that was Instagram a few years ago. So TikTok is quite new. It's also highly visual. 500 million monthly active users. It's massive, and the most common age range is youth. So 14 to 19, or rather the younger range of youth. So 41% of users on TikTok are between the ages of 14 and 19. So the pros are that it's video led, and if you are doing anything with video and you're trying to reach youth, this really might be a platform for you. It's had massive, rapid growth. It's grown exponentially in the past year or so. Another pro is that you can actually download videos from TikTok, which you can't. It's quite hard to do that from Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So that's another pro, is that you can download videos, and because you can download videos, you have a metric there that you can very easily measure, which is video downloads from TikTok. The cons are that TikTok has a lot of subculture, and to someone who doesn't use it, the subculture and the tone of voice can be quite inaccessible. So it can be difficult to gauge how to write your content for TikTok unless you know users. So I think this is where the youngsters you're working with are going to be really useful. But I think this is where the youngsters you work with are going to have very specific insight into tone of voice on TikTok, and whether or not your campaign is your campaign should even be on there. Then there's Twitter. So 330 million monthly active users. Most common age ranges, again, that 18 to 29 and 30 to 49. It's really good for movement building. really good for movement building because you have the retweets. You can kind of it's easy to do big Twitter actions via Twitter because you have it's a very public, it's got a very public nature, and it's also very searchable. Another pro is direct access to celebrities and influencers. So if you wanted that direct access, you could have it. The con is that it's got a very public nature, which means that, I mean, that can be a good and a bad thing, but Twitter also comes with some real negatives there. LinkedIn, so 660 million monthly active members rather, and that is most common age ranges are 18 to 29 and 30 to 49 again. It's had rapid growth amongst 18 to 24-year-olds because they're usually, very often, if they're leaving university or they're entering the workforce for the first time, a lot of them will be actively encouraged to join LinkedIn and make connections via LinkedIn. And particularly in this time when we are having to kind of shelter at home, that's a big aspect. So there's that. So it's had rapid growth amongst younger people. It's got it really encourages discussion, and when you see campaigns on LinkedIn for big attitude campaigns, you do see a lot of discussion. The con is that the tone of voice around social justice issues hasn't quite been established, but that's where you would be able to play a role in making that new normal. It's quite difficult to gauge what the tone of voice around anything that's not sort of explicitly about business should be on TikTok. Oh, sorry, on LinkedIn. So you can really play around with it and see what works. Another con is that advertising on LinkedIn can be expensive. Then you have Snapchat. So 210 million daily active users. This is a very, very millennial platform. It says 18 to 29, but actually a lot of people on Snapchat are sort of 25 to 29. Good for advertisers, and it's highly gamified. And what I mean by gamified is that they've got lots of little user experience aspects that mean that it's quite addictive. So it's Snapchat. I mean, there would be no TikTok without Snapchat. It's the precursor to a lot of social media aspects, like stories on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and now YouTube. Snapchat invented all that because it's highly gamified and it's highly addictive. The cons are that there are very limited analytics from Snapchat. It's not ideal, and you have that relatively limited audience, but they do use Snapchat. So that's sort of between 25 and 29. That audience is there. My next slide, and I'll go through this a bit quicker. Apologies. Website analytics. So this is measurement tools, pros and cons. So there's lots of ways you can measure things. I'm just going to go through the pros and cons of those. So website analytics, for example, Google Analytics, there's Adobe Analytics as well. The pros are it gives you comprehensive data about your website performance. So that's really useful. The cons, particularly the free products such as Google Analytics, and there's one called Piwik, which you may come across, are that it's highly configurable and it often requires specialist knowledge. I'm trained. I've been trained on Google Analytics for years, and there's still things that I come across every so often when training people that confuses me. So it's highly configurable. You often need a developer to work in conjunction with a data analyst. But once it's done, it's fantastic. Really great comprehensive data about your website performance, and it's free. You then have what I'm going to refer to as native social analytics tools. So these are the social analytics tools that are in that actually exist within the social networks themselves. So Facebook Insights, for instance, Twitter Insights, Instagram Insights. That's what I'm referring to when I talk about native social analytics tools. And the pros are that it gives you comprehensive data about social media, brand account performance. But the cons are that you need to own the account. So if we're talking about earned media here, where you've posted, or somebody else, another account has picked up your campaign and they love it, and they featured it on their accounts, you're not going to have access to the analytics from that, so you need to get in contact with that person. Another con is that there's very little historical data, and that it can be difficult to compare metrics across platforms, because reach for Twitter is measured differently to reach from Facebook. They're measured very differently. So those are things to take into consideration. Focus groups. So these are things that provide deep qualitative information and an insight into thoughts and feelings. And these are things that actually you may not get from the more quantitative data. So that makes it that means that there is a con, because it's not quantifiable. It's normally has to be triangulated with other methods, and it can be expensive to run focus groups. You then have surveys and polls, very similar, but they can provide quick insight around specific questions, and they can also be run digitally. So that's always good. They can be expensive, can be less often actually than focus groups. There are a lot of cheaper focus groups. And you have to design the questions in a way that sometimes requires specialist knowledge, because you need to make sure that you're not asking what's called leading questions, where you're guiding the participant into an answer. So there are things that you have to make sure you've been careful about when you're designing questions. Another method, which is one that we talked about much earlier, but that was media monitoring and press clippings. So that gives you valuable data on press coverage and clear indication of reach and media impact. And that's a real pro of media monitoring. You can see where your content is being picked up by the press. So that can also give you information on which journalists you can establish good relationships with. A con is that to get things into the press and actually even getting those good relationships with journalists, it can cost money, especially if you're paying for advertising there. And it can be a bit unpredictable, because journalists can decide whether, on almost spontaneously, whether or not they're going to feature your campaign. So you won't always know. And the final one is that footfall data. So it's great because it gives you an indication of reach. It's a very solid reach metric. And the con is that these metrics are not always, this data is not always updated frequently, so it can be out of date. So for instance, any billboard advertisements that you were going to put out onto busy shopping areas now, so let's say you had a big billboard advertisement, there's no way that the reach indication, the footfall data from that is going to be accurate right now, because a lot of countries are under lockdown, and that information is not likely to have been updated. So that's actually the final slide, and now I'm going to stop sharing, and we can go and take some questions and answers.